The gun was pressed against the back of Winifred Sullivan's skull before she even heard the floorboard creak. "Don't you move," the voice behind her rasped, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the leather of his gloves, the particular kind of rot that lived in men who had long since stopped caring what they destroyed. "Don't you scream, don't you run, and don't you think for one single second that I won't do exactly what I've been paid to do." She did not move. She had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of survival. Her hands were pressed flat against the rough-hewn table in front of her, a half-eaten bowl of stew gone cold beside them, a candle burning low in a tin holder. The room was small, a boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, 1882, and she had chosen it precisely because it was small, because small meant fewer hiding places for the kind of men who followed her. She had been wrong. "Who sent you?" Her voice came out steadier than anything she felt inside, steadier than the furious hammering of her heart against her ribs, steadier than the absolute terror that was trying to crawl up her throat. The man laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "You know who sent me, Miss Sullivan. You've always known he'd come for you eventually. Edgar Crane." The name rose in her mind like smoke from a grass fire, spreading, choking, inevitable. She had been running from Edgar Crane for 2 years and 3 months, ever since the night she had watched him put a bullet in her brother's chest in the back room of a saloon in Abilene, and she had been stupid enough, brave enough, or simply reckless enough to tell a federal marshal what she had seen. The marshal had been found floating in the Smoky Hill River 4 days later, and Winifred had been running ever since. "Tell him I'm not a witness anymore," she said quietly. "Tell him I left the territory. Tell him whatever you need to tell him." "Too late for that," the man said. And then a second voice came from outside the window, low and hard as iron. "I'd put that gun down now if I were you." The man behind Winifred froze. "I'm not asking twice," the second voice said. There was a terrible pause in the world, the kind of pause that exists between a lightning bolt and the thunder that follows it. And then the hammer of the gun behind her head was slowly, grudgingly uncocked. She heard the weapon set on the table. She heard boots on floorboards. She heard the front door wrenched open, and the sound of a brief, efficient struggle that lasted no more than 30 seconds, and then silence. When she finally turned around, a man was standing in the doorway with a rope in his hands, and a look on his face that suggested he had seen worse, and expected to see worse still. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that men who worked land were broad, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the particular gray-green of a Kansas sky before a storm. He had a deputy's star on his shirt that caught the candlelight. "You all right?" he asked, not gently, not harshly, simply, as though all right was a real thing he believed she might be. She was shaking. She had not realized until that moment that she was shaking. She pressed her hands together in her lap to hide it and lifted her chin. "I'm fine," she said, which was the greatest lie she had told that week. "The man outside is tied to your porch post," he said. "I'll get him to the jail in the morning. Tonight you ought to lock your windows." He turned to leave. "Wait," she said. He waited. She looked at him for a long moment, this stranger with his deputy's star and his quiet way of existing in a room as though he had no need to fill it with himself. And she said the only true thing she could think of. "Thank you." He nodded once. He left. She did not know then that the name on the door of the sheriff's office on Main Street said Gideon Ralston. She did not know that she would spend the next several months learning everything about him, or that the most remarkable thing about him would turn out to be this: that standing on the porch of his house at the edge of town on a cold October evening, 6 months from now, she would feel something she had not felt anywhere in years. Something she had almost convinced herself no longer existed for women like her. She would feel safe, but that was later. First there was the matter of running, of hiding, of the long and terrible road that had led her here, and the longer and more complicated one that was still ahead. Winifred Sullivan had not always been a woman who ran. She had been born in 1857 in St. Joseph, Missouri, the second of 3 children of Thomas Sullivan, a surveyor, and Mary Clare Sullivan, née Donahue, who had come from County Clare at the age of 17 and spent the rest of her life being braver than anyone gave her credit for. They were not a wealthy family, but they were a close one, and Winifred had grown up with the particular certainty that the people around her were fundamentally safe to love. That was the thing about her childhood she had never stopped grieving, not the poverty they sometimes touched, not the hard Missouri winters, but the absolute goneness of that certainty. The understanding that love was safe, that the world was mostly meant for living. Her brother Daniel was 4 years older and had her same dark red hair, her same tendency to speak too honestly when a softer truth would have served better, and a laugh that could make strangers forget their troubles for 30 seconds. He had come west in 1879 with plans to establish himself in the cattle trade, and Winifred had followed him the following year after their mother died, and there was nothing left in St. Joseph to hold her. Their father had been gone since 1875, not dead, simply departed in the way that some men were, as though fatherhood were a season rather than a permanent condition. She had arrived in Abilene in the summer of 1880 with $14, a single trunk, a working knowledge of bookkeeping, and the kind of determination that people sometimes called stubbornness when they were being unkind about it. Daniel had been doing well enough by then. He worked as a cattle broker's assistant, honest work for honest pay, and she had found a position almost immediately keeping the accounts for a dry goods merchant named Harlow Patterson, who was approximately 100 years old in spirit if not in body, and who treated her with the formal, slightly puzzled respect of a man who had never before been quite so efficiently organized. She had been 23 years old, and she would think later, happy. Ordinarily, quietly, sustainably happy in the way that people are when they have enough to eat and someone they love nearby and work that they do not hate. It was not a grand happiness. It was better than that. Edgar Crane had arrived in Abilene in the winter of 1880. He was not, in the way of story villains, immediately recognizable as what he was. He was polished and well-dressed, and he had a way of making people feel important when he spoke to them, a talent so effective it functioned almost like a weapon. He had established himself quickly in the business community of Abilene. He was, he said, a land speculator and investment broker, and within 6 months had cultivated relationships with the mayor, the major cattlemen, the bank president, and anyone else whose influence could be leveraged into the quiet empire he was in the process of building. The empire was not, as Winifred would eventually come to understand, built on land speculation. It was built on extortion, on fraud, on the systematic manipulation of cattle records and bank documents, and on the absolute, specific willingness to remove any person who threatened the architecture of it. He had been doing this for 8 years by the time he arrived in Abilene. He was very good at it. He left very few traces. Daniel had encountered one of the traces. That was the problem. He had been helping reconcile inventory records for a cattle broker and had found, buried in the numbers in a way that required both a trained eye and a willingness to believe what the eye was seeing, evidence of a systematic fraud that ran directly back to Crane. Daniel being the kind of man he was, fundamentally constitutionally unable to look away from a wrong, he had gone to Edgar Crane directly. He had been 27 years old, and he had believed that confronting a man honestly was a form of courage. He had not yet learned that some kinds of courage are simply another name for catastrophic naivety. Crane had invited him to discuss the matter privately. The private meeting had been in the back room of a saloon on a Tuesday evening in November of 1880. Winifred had been there because Daniel had asked her to wait for him outside. He had not wanted her involved, but had not wanted to be alone in that part of town, and she had understood well enough what that meant. She had been sitting on the steps of a building across the narrow alley, hidden in the dark and the cold, and the particular invisibility that women in modest dresses occupied in spaces like that. She had heard the shot. She had looked through the gap in the saloon's rear wall planking, and she had seen Crane holster his gun, and she had seen her brother on the floor, and she had known with absolute certainty the specific shape of what had just been done. She had run. She had run because she had known with the same absolute certainty that staying meant dying. She had run to the federal marshal's office, she had told her story, and then the marshal was dead and she was running again, and she had been running more or less ever since. 2 years, 14 towns, a succession of false names abandoned when she felt the air change around her, when strangers asked too specific questions, when the wrong face appeared on the wrong street corner. She had worked as a bookkeeper, a seamstress, a school teacher for 3 months in a small Oklahoma Territory town, a laundress when there was nothing else available. She had learned to read a room the way she had once learned to read a balance sheet quickly, thoroughly, with an eye for where the numbers did not add up. She had learned to sleep lightly and trust no one. She had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in September of 1882 under the name Winifred Carroll, and she had been there exactly 11 days when the man with the gun had appeared in her rented room, and the quiet stranger with the deputy's star had appeared in her doorway. She spent the night with the door locked and the window latched and her heart doing things that hearts were not designed to sustain for extended periods. In the morning, she told herself to leave. She packed her trunk. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the trunk, and then she looked at the door. She went to the sheriff's office instead. The outer room held a desk, 2 chairs, a rack for weapons on the wall, and a young man of perhaps 19 who introduced himself as Deputy Hatch and who seemed genuinely startled to see a woman walk through the door before 9 in the morning. The deputy told her that the sheriff was in the back with a prisoner and that she could wait, and she sat in one of the chairs and folded her hands in her lap and waited. When Gideon Ralston came through the inner door, he was carrying a tin coffee cup and wearing the same expression he had worn the night before, the expression of a man who had long since made his peace with the specific weight of his responsibilities and simply continued carrying them. He looked at her. He clearly remembered her. He pulled the second chair around to his side of the desk and sat down, and he said, "Miss Carroll," because that was the name she had given at the boarding house. She hesitated for just one beat. Then she said, "Sullivan. My name is Winifred Sullivan." It came out like something being set down after a very long time of carrying it. "I need to tell you something about the man you arrested last night." He set his coffee cup on the desk. He said nothing, which she had already begun to understand was his way of indicating that you had his full attention. She told him, not all of it, not the whole 2 years, not Daniel, not every detail, but enough. She told him about Edgar Crane. She told him that Crane was almost certainly the reason the man with the gun had been in her room. She told him that this was not the first such incident, that there had been 3 previous attempts in as many years, none of them successful, all of them close enough to have permanently recalibrated her understanding of what close meant. Gideon Ralston listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This Crane, he's in Abilene. He may have moved his operation by now, he's careful. And you're the only witness to the shooting. The only living one." Another pause. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down again. "The man in my cell goes by the name of Cotton Daly," he said. "He's got warrants in 3 counties for various offenses, none of them connected to any Crane I've heard of. But that doesn't mean the connection isn't there." He looked at her directly. "How long were you planning to stay in Caldwell?" "I wasn't," she said. "I was going to leave this morning." "Where?" "I hadn't decided." He nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking about something that was not entirely related to the immediate conversation. She watched him the way she had learned to watch everyone carefully, cataloging what she saw, and what she saw was a man who was genuinely trying to figure out the right thing to do, not the convenient thing, the right thing. She had encountered that particular effort infrequently enough in the last 2 years that it still struck her as remarkable when she saw it. "Stay," he said finally. "Give me 2 weeks. I'll send some letters, make some inquiries about Crane. The man in my cell might be willing to give us something useful if the alternative is a trial for the other warrants. If I can build something solid enough to pass to the federal authorities, you'd have a better chance of this ending properly instead of just running until it doesn't work anymore." She looked at him. "You're a town sheriff," she said. It was not unkind. It was just a fact. Edgar Crane has resources and connections that go considerably beyond Caldwell, Kansas. "I know what I am," he said, and there was something in the steadiness of it that made it not sound like a limitation at all. "And I know that what you're describing isn't sustainable. Stay 2 weeks. If nothing comes of it, you're no worse off than you are right now." She should have said no. Every trained instinct she possessed said to say no, to pick up her trunk, to get on the next stage heading somewhere Crane's men hadn't located yet. She had kept herself alive for 2 years by trusting those instincts absolutely. She said yes. She was not entirely sure afterward which part of him had overridden the instinct. It might have been the direct way he looked at her, without the particular quality of evaluation that most men brought to looking at women, the unconscious inventory of what she might be useful for. It might have been simply that she was tired in a way that had gone past her bones and into something deeper, something that she did not have a word for, and the thought of staying in one place for 2 weeks felt like setting down a load so heavy she had forgotten what upright felt like. Or it might have been something else, something that she was not yet prepared to name, some quality in that still, serious face that had nothing to do with tactics or survival. She stayed. She found a room at a different boarding house, Mrs. Aldrich's, on the east side of town, which had better locks on the doors and a landlady of formidable width and disposition who was entirely unintimidated by anyone, and she took a position helping the local newspaper editor, a man named Josiah Fenn who was perpetually behind on his accounts, and delighted to have someone who could read a ledger without squinting. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself 2 weeks, no more. She saw Gideon Ralston nearly every day. Not by design, or rather not by her design. Caldwell was not a large town. Their paths crossed at the general store, at the post office, in the street in the early mornings when he was making his rounds, and she was heading to the newspaper office. He was always unfailingly correct with her, a nod, a brief exchange of necessary information about the Crane situation, nothing that was not strictly purposeful. And yet she found herself increasingly aware of him in the specific way that one becomes aware of a fixed point in an uncertain landscape. He was the same every time she encountered him. In a life that had been defined for 2 years by the radical changeability of everything, there was something in that sameness that she found, against all her better judgment, enormously comforting. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about people in small towns, from the accumulated fragments of other people's conversations. She learned that he was 32 years old, that he had been born in Tennessee and come west with his family as a boy, that he had been the sheriff of Caldwell for 3 years and before that had been a deputy in Wichita. She learned that he owned a small piece of land at the edge of town, 40 acres, a house he had built himself, a barn, a few horses, and that he was generally regarded by the residents of Caldwell as taciturn but absolutely trustworthy, which she suspected was a combination that had served him well. She learned that he had been married once briefly, a woman named Clara who had died of fever in 1877, and that the subject was not one he raised himself. She also learned, from Cotton Daly, who had decided that the better part of valor involved significant cooperation with the local law enforcement, that Edgar Crane had moved his primary operation from Abilene to Dodge City in 1881, that he had 3 men on permanent payroll for the specific purpose of tracking Winifred Sullivan, and that the price on her silence, Daly, was careful not to say price on her head. But the implication was the same, was substantial enough to attract serious attention. Gideon brought her this information on a Thursday evening at the newspaper office, after Josiah Fenn had gone home. He set the written summary of Daly's statement on the desk in front of her and stood back while she read it, and she was grateful for the distance because her hands were shaking again, and she did not want him to see it. 3 men. She had always suspected there were multiple, but having a number made it real in a new and specific way. "I've written to the federal marshal's office in Topeka," he said. "Given them Daly's statement and everything you've told me. They have more resources than I do to move against someone like Crane. How long will they take to respond? Could be weeks, could be longer." She looked up from the paper. "And in the meantime, Crane knows I'm in Caldwell. Daly told him before he was arrested. I know. Then sending me out of here alone is just, I'm not sending you out of here alone," he said. It was stated with such calm finality that for a moment she simply looked at him. "You have a town to manage," she said. "Caldwell is quiet. Deputy Hatch is capable." He paused. "I'm not going to let him have you, Miss Sullivan." The way he said it was not dramatic. He was not, she had come to understand, a dramatic man. He said it the way a person states a simple, decided fact. And that simplicity was what went through her like a clean, cold knife, because she had not had anyone say anything like that to her in 2 years. She had been the sole custodian of her own survival for so long that the notion of someone else engaging with it, not as a transaction, not as a professional obligation, but as a decision made and standing, was almost incomprehensible. She looked back at the paper. She kept her expression level. She said, "Thank you, Sheriff." He left. She sat in the empty newspaper office for a long time after, listening to the sounds of Caldwell at evening, horses and voices, and the distant, improbable music from the saloon 2 streets over, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she could not entirely account for. The weeks began to pass. October arrived, and with it a chill in the air that came sharp off the Kansas plains, the particular kind of cold that was not merely temperature but atmosphere, a reminder that this was a land that did not accommodate softness. Winifred continued working for Josiah Fenn. She continued staying at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house. She became, tentatively, cautiously, something almost like a regular fixture of Caldwell, which was the most frightening thing she had experienced in 2 years, because regularity was a form of visibility, and visibility was the thing she had been most afraid of. And yet nothing came. No further men appeared in her room. No strangers asked pointed questions at the post office. She began, very gradually, to lower the constant vigilance by just one increment. Not gone, never entirely gone, but modulated enough that she could sleep through a whole night and wake up feeling something other than the immediate galvanizing need to assess threats. Gideon Ralston came to see her in the evening sometimes, in Josiah Fenn's office when Fenn was gone, or on the porch of Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house where there was a bench that faced the street. These visits were always stated as updates on the Crane investigation. There had been a response from Topeka, cautiously positive. There were inquiries being made in Dodge City through contacts he would not name, and she told herself that this was the nature of them, that they were professional and purposeful. And then she would go inside at the end of the evening and acknowledge to herself with scrupulous honesty that somewhere in the last half hour she had stopped thinking about Crane at all and had been entirely occupied with the conversation itself. He asked her about her work. Not in the polite, passing way of social obligation, but with genuine interest, specific follow-up questions that indicated he had actually retained what she'd said the time before. She told him about the bookkeeping, the way numbers in a ledger were like a language, how you could read the health of a business in its patterns the same way a doctor read symptoms. He told her about surveying land disputes, which apparently constituted a significant portion of his work and was more mathematically complex than she would have assumed. They talked about Missouri, which he had passed through but never settled in. They talked about the particular isolation of the plains. They talked about books. She was a reader, always had been, and was pleased to discover that he was too, in the spare and practical way of a man who had limited time for it but valued it absolutely when he had it. One evening in mid-October, he asked, "What did you want before all of this, before you came west?" She thought about it seriously. "I wanted to learn law," she said. "I had a notion of being useful in the direction of making things more fair." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have been," he said. Simple, no qualification. She looked at him. The lamplight from the boarding house window was doing something very particular to his face, catching the planes of it, and she was aware with a sudden, inconvenient clarity of how handsome he was, not in the showy way of men who knew it, but in the entirely unself-conscious way of someone whose appearance was simply a fact about them that they had never thought to leverage. She looked away. "You still could," he said. After. She held that word in her mind. She had not allowed herself to think in after for 2 years. The future had been a tactical calculation, next town, next name, next 3 days, not a landscape with any actual features to it. "Maybe," she said. He walked her to the boarding house door. He said good night. She said good night. She went inside and stood with her back against the door in the narrow hallway, and she breathed and she thought. This is a dark past and a complicated present and an entirely uncertain future, and none of that is preventing you from developing feelings for this man, Winifred, so perhaps you should give some serious thought to what you are doing. She gave it serious thought. She concluded, after considerable deliberation, that what she was doing was entirely natural and also potentially dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with Edgar Crane. Because Gideon Ralston was a fixed point, a settled man, rooted to this place and this work, and she was a woman who had not been able to stop moving for 2 years and had no guarantee of being able to stop moving for the foreseeable future. Developing feelings of any depth for a man like that was, she told herself firmly, a form of setting herself up for a heartbreak she did not have the emotional reserves to withstand. She stopped giving it serious thought. She was not, it turned out, capable of the required detachment. The reply from the federal marshal's office in Topeka arrived on a Wednesday in late October. Gideon brought it to her at the newspaper office and she read it twice, slowly. The marshal in Topeka, a man named Harrison Cole, had been investigating Edgar Crane on separate grounds for approximately 8 months. The information provided by Gideon, combined with Cotton Daly's testimony, represented a significant advancement in that investigation. Marshal Cole wanted Winifred's sworn formal statement. He wanted her in Topeka within the week if possible. He was, he said, positioned to act. She looked up from the letter. Something moved through her that she had no easy name for, not quite relief, not quite fear, not quite hope, but an amalgam of all three that sat in her chest like something very large, very slowly beginning to move. "He thinks it can be done," she said. "He has jurisdiction," Gideon said, "and resources, and now he has testimony. Yes, I think it can be done. And if it doesn't work, it will work." He said it with the same quality of flat, standing certainty that he had brought to the statement that he was not going to let Crane have her, and she felt the same response to it, that slight, startling dissolution of something she had been holding very tightly for a very long time. "You need to come with me," she said, "to Topeka, to give your own statement. I know. Can you leave the town? Deputy Hatch has been handling more of the day-to-day than you might think," he said. A pause. "I'll take you to Topeka, Winifred." It was the first time he had used her given name. She was almost certain he had not done it deliberately. The word had simply come out, and he held it for just one beat afterward with an expression of very slight, uncharacteristic uncertainty, as though he were testing whether it had been appropriate. She kept her face neutral and said, "All right then. When do we leave?" They left on Friday morning by stage, accompanied by Deputy Hatch as far as the county line, who then turned back. The journey was 2 days. They stopped overnight in a town called Tiverton, at a hotel that Gideon clearly knew, the proprietor greeting him by name and asking no questions about their particular traveling arrangement that Winifred had been slightly braced to receive. She had her own room. She slept better than she had in weeks, which she attributed to the fact that she was moving. That action felt safer than waiting. that doing something purposeful was always better for her than sitting still. She did not examine the other possible reason she was sleeping well, the one that had to do with the man in the adjacent room. On the second day, as the stage moved through the flat October prairie under a sky that was doing something extraordinary with the light, turning the whole world the color of brass and rust, Gideon said, "Tell me about Daniel." She looked at him. The question had come quietly, without preamble, and she understood immediately what it was, not a tactical inquiry, but the thing that had been present under the surface of their months-long conversation, the missing piece that she had never quite been able to speak without the whole structure of her composure becoming uncertain. She told him about Daniel. She told him about the red hair and the laugh and the moral stubbornness that had been exactly like her own and had gotten him killed at 27. She told him about the night in the alley, the shot, the way she had known before she stopped running that she was going to spend a very long time paying for having survived. Her voice remained steady through most of it. Near the end it did not. Gideon did not say that he was sorry, he said. He sounds like someone worth knowing. She pressed her lips together. She looked out the window. He was, she said. The stage rocked through a long curve in the road, and when it straightened she was aware that Gideon had shifted slightly closer on the seat, not dramatically, not in a way that could have been called a gesture, but enough that the space between them was slightly less than it had been. She did not move away. They arrived in Topeka on Saturday afternoon. The federal marshal's office was on the second floor of a brick building near the state courthouse, and Marshal Harrison Cole turned out to be a compact, precise man in his 40s with a gray-streaked beard and reading spectacles on a chain, who shook Gideon's hand and looked at Winifred with the careful assessment of someone cataloging evidence. He asked her to come back first thing Monday morning to give her formal statement, and he gave them the names of 2 reputable hotels. The weekend was, in the technical sense, free time. She had not had free time in 2 years. She was not entirely sure she remembered how it worked. On Saturday evening, Gideon suggested they get supper at a restaurant near the hotel, an actual restaurant, with actual tablecloths and a lamp on each table, something that she had not experienced since leaving St. Joseph 3 years ago. They sat across from each other over roast beef and bread, and the particular excellent coffee that Topeka apparently managed to produce, and without the specific pressure of the Crane situation crowding the space between them, or perhaps because of the distance from Caldwell, or perhaps because it was Saturday evening, and the restaurant was warm, and the world outside was doing something quiet with the dark. The conversation became something different. It became personal. Not in a probing way, he was not a probing man, but in the way of 2 people who have established sufficient trust to stop speaking exclusively in careful sentences and begin occasionally saying what they actually mean. He told her about Clara. She had been a schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west with a genuine evangelical conviction that the frontier needed more education. She had been funny and determined, and had died of scarlet fever in the autumn of 1877, 11 months after they married, and Gideon had spent the following 2 years doing his work and not very much else. She listened to this without interrupting, the way he always listened to her, and when he was done she said, "I'm sorry, she sounds like someone worth knowing too." He looked at her across the table. She was. There was a pause between them that was not uncomfortable, one of those pauses that exists when something true has been said and both people are simply letting it settle. Then Gideon said quietly, "When this is done with Crane," he stopped, started again. "I'm not very good at this," he said. At this particular kind of conversation, she felt something in her chest that might have been amusement and might have been something considerably warmer. "You're doing fine," she said. He looked at her with a directness that was almost disarming. "I want to ask if you're planning to go somewhere else," he said. When it's done, I want to ask what you're going to do." She held his gaze. "I haven't decided," she said. "I spent 2 years not being allowed to think past the next 3 days. I'm still learning how to think further ahead than that." "Caldwell is a reasonable place," he said, "for thinking further ahead if you were looking for somewhere to consider." She was quiet for a moment. The candlelight between them was very steady. "Is that a professional recommendation from the local law enforcement?" she asked. "No," he said, "it is not." She picked up her coffee cup to give her hand something to do. She was smiling, not the careful, controlled, useful smile she had been deploying for 2 years as a social instrument, but a real one, unguarded, which felt alarming and entirely beyond her ability to prevent. "Caldwell," she said, as though she were testing the word. "I'll think about it." "All right," he said, and there was something in the way the tension went out of his shoulders that told her this answer mattered to him in ways he was not going to say in a Topeka restaurant on a Saturday evening. On Monday morning, she gave her formal statement to Marshal Cole. It took 3 hours. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was the same quality that had made her a good bookkeeper, the refusal to allow important details to fall through the gaps. And by the time she was done, she had given the federal marshal everything she knew about Edgar Crane, organized and sequenced with the precision of a woman who had spent 2 years keeping the whole story in her head. Gideon gave his statement in the afternoon. Cotton Daly's signed testimony, which Gideon had brought in writing, was reviewed and deemed significant. Marshal Cole looked at them both over his desk with the expression of a man who has just watched a crucial piece of a puzzle align. "Been building this case for 8 months, he said. "What you've brought me is the corner piece." He looked at Winifred. "You understand this will go to trial, you'll need to testify." "I understand," she said. "It may be months before we're ready to move." "I understand that too. And in the meantime you'll need to remain somewhere we can reach you, somewhere your safety can be reasonably assured." He glanced at Gideon. "I'll want law enforcement contact in whatever town you're staying." She looked at Gideon. He was looking at his hands. He did not look up, but there was something in the set of his jaw that she had learned to read in the past weeks, the particular quality of deliberate neutrality that meant he was being very careful not to influence a decision that he believed was hers to make. She looked back at Marshal Cole. "I'll be in Caldwell," she said. "You can reach me through Sheriff Ralston." On the stage back to Caldwell, Gideon said nothing about this for a very long time. The prairie moved past the windows in its enormous, indifferent way, and the afternoon light went long and gold across it, and she was aware again of his proximity on the seat and the particular quality of the silence between them, which was not emptiness but density full of things that had not yet been said. Eventually he said, "Thank you for telling Cole you'd stay." "I wasn't doing it for you," she said. "I know," he said. "Although," she said and stopped. "Although," he said. "Although," she said carefully, "it was not an entirely irrelevant consideration." She felt rather than saw the change in him, something that moved through him like the warming of a room that had been cold for a long time. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. They arrived back in Caldwell in the evening of the second day, November beginning to move in with purpose from the north, the air carrying the smell of coming winter. The stage let them off on Main Street, and Gideon walked her to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, which was their custom, and she had her hand on the gate when he said, "I'd like you to come to supper. At the house." A pause. "My house." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with the careful, undemanding attention that was characteristic of him, offering, not pressing. "When?" she said. "Sunday," he said. "If you'd like to." "I'd like to," she said. She went inside. She stood in the hallway with the same feeling she had stood there with before, but amplified, larger, warmer, more present, and she pressed the heels of her hands to her cheeks and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Sunday came with cold sunshine and a sky the color of clean blue pottery. She walked to the edge of town where Gideon's land began. She had not been there before. She had only known its general direction from a description by Mrs. Aldrich, who had opinions about everything, including Gideon Ralston's 40 acres, which she called plain but proper, which Winifred had come to understand was the highest compliment in the Aldrich lexicon. The house was not large. It was the house of a single man who had built it with his own hands and no specific intention of entertaining much, a solid two-room structure of good timber and decent roof work. But it was well made, and the yard had a quality of keptness about it, the fence maintained, the porch boards sound. There was a barn at a distance and 2 horses in the paddock, who watched her approach with the mild, contemplative curiosity of horses everywhere. She came up the path and she stepped up onto the porch, and she stood there for a moment in the cold, clear November air. She had not felt safe anywhere in years. Not truly, functionally, bodily safe, the kind of safe that lives in the muscles instead of just in the calculations of the mind. She had been safe-ish, temporarily safe, safe enough, safe by the skin of her teeth. But not safe the way a person is safe when the ground beneath them is solid, and the walls are real, and the person inside the house is someone who will not, under any circumstances, let harm reach them if there is any human means of preventing it. She stood on his porch and she felt it. She felt safe. It hit her so unexpectedly, so completely, that she stood absolutely still with one hand on the porch railing and simply breathed and let it move through her. The cold air, the horses in the paddock, the sound of movement inside the house, the smell of wood smoke and bread, the particular exact quality of this moment, which was unremarkable in every way except that she was standing here and she was not afraid. The door opened. Gideon stood there with a dish towel over his shoulder looking at her. He took in whatever her face was doing in that moment. She had no idea what her face was doing. It was beyond management, and he was quiet for 1 second and then he said, "Come in." She went in. The inside of the house was warm. A cast-iron stove in the main room, 2 chairs pulled close to it, a table with plain wooden plates set, and a pot of something excellent smelling on the stove. A shelf of books against one wall, more than she had expected. A lamp that gave a steady amber light. It was quiet in the way of houses that have been built with enough care that the walls do something useful with sound. She sat in one of the chairs by the stove and he brought her coffee and they talked while he finished the supper. And the conversation was, she would remember it the rest of her life. The easiest conversation she had ever had with anyone. Easier even than conversations with Daniel in their St. Joseph years. Easier even than conversations with her mother. It was the ease of 2 people who have, gradually and without intending to, become entirely comfortable with each other. Who have stopped performing and started simply speaking. They talked through supper and after it. He showed her the books, she recognized several, found 2 she'd never heard of and immediately wanted to read, found one she'd read 3 times and told him so, and he looked at her with an expression of such warm, specific attention that she had to look back at the book to collect herself. The stove made its quiet sounds. The November dark outside did its enormous, peaceful thing. At some point near the end of the evening, in the natural quiet that follows a particularly satisfying stretch of conversation, she said, "When I walked up the path today, when I stood on the porch," she stopped, gathering the words. She was not typically given to this kind of admission. The 2 years had trained her out of admitting vulnerability with a thoroughness she was only beginning to undo. "I felt safe," she said. "I didn't know how much I'd missed that until I felt it." He was very still. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not entirely read. It was too deep for that, too layered, but she could see something moving in it, something that corresponded to what she had said in a way that was not entirely about sympathy. "Good," he said very quietly. "I want you to feel that." She looked at the fire. "I want you to feel it here," he said, "not just tonight." She looked at him then, and whatever her face was doing now, it was clearly doing something because his expression changed, a kind of opening in it, a careful, unguarded quality that she had never seen on him before. He was not a man who unguarded easily. She understood this, had catalogued it, had spent weeks noting the particular protectedness of him and recognizing in it a precise mirror of her own. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have a dark past and a complicated present, and I don't sleep properly, and I trust badly, and I'll probably argue with you about things that don't require arguing about because it's become a habit." "I know," he said. I'm telling you those things on purpose, she said, so that what I'm about to say isn't under any false pretenses. He waited. She met his eyes. I love you, she said. I think I've been managing the process of loving you since approximately the 3rd week of October, and I'm tired of managing it, and there it is. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to be alarming, and then he said, I've been in love with you since the morning you walked into my office and told me your real name. She breathed. She breathed again. He crossed the room and sat in the chair next to hers and took her hand, which was the first time he had ever touched her deliberately, and her whole body registered it as a profound and significant event while her face, she suspected, remained approximately neutral out of sheer ingrained habit. His hand was warm and the grip was careful, firm enough to be real, light enough to be a question, and she answered the question by turning her hand over and holding his. They sat like that for a while without talking, and the fire did its work, and outside the November wind moved across the plains with its old, patient disregard, and she sat in this room that she had walked to through cold sunshine this morning, and she thought, this is what after looks like. Not an abstraction. This specific thing in this specific place with this specific man. She stayed until it was nearly too late to walk back safely in the dark, and then he walked her back. Of course he did. She would have been surprised if he hadn't, and at the gate of Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house he stopped and looked at her in the dark with the particular serious quality that was simply his face when it was paying attention, and she went up on her toes and kissed him, and he kissed her back with a careful, unhurried thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about it for some time and had no intention of rushing. She walked inside feeling something she had not felt since the last good day before Daniel died. She felt entirely, recklessly, magnificently alive. The weeks that followed were the strangest she had experienced since before she came west, because they required her to do something she had forgotten was possible, to live forward, to plan. To have plans that extended past the next town, the next name, the next hour. She was in Caldwell and she was staying in Caldwell, and Gideon Ralston had said that was what he wanted, and she had said it was what she wanted, and now the future was not a featureless fog but a terrain with actual landmarks. She continued working for Josiah Fenn, who had by now formed a deep attachment to the organization of his financial records and was paying her a wage that reflected this. She had a regular pew at the Sunday service at the Methodist Church, which she attended partly from genuine inclination, and partly because the social texture of it, the particular predictable ritual of it, the same people every Sunday, the same hymns, the same handshaking afterward was something she had not allowed herself in 2 years, and she found that she had missed it in a way she had not recognized until she had it back. She had become, in some way she was still adjusting to, a resident of Caldwell, a person who belonged to a place. She had supper with Gideon on Sundays at the house, and increasingly on other evenings too. They went to the lectures at the town hall when there were any. They argued, as she had predicted, about things that didn't require arguing about. She was right that she had developed it into a habit, but so had he in his own way, and their arguments had a quality of intellectual vigor to them that she found was one of the most consistent pleasures of knowing him. He was not a man who backed down from a position he believed in, which made it genuinely satisfying when he was persuaded, because it only happened when the argument was actually sound. She was persuaded by him in equal measure on a roughly equivalent number of occasions, which she considered an excellent sign. He kissed her at his door on most evenings when she left, and she kissed him back with increasing unself-consciousness, and there was a quality of rightness in it that was different from any other rightness she had experienced. Not reckless rightness or convenient rightness, but the rightness of something that had come about through honest means, and was therefore honest all the way to the center. December brought snow to the Kansas plains. January was brutal and clean, the cold doing its absolute most, and Winifred found herself going to the house after the newspaper office some evenings simply because the fire there was better, and the company was not available anywhere else. She had begun reading his books. He had better taste than she'd expected, a mixture of history and natural science, and two particular novels that she discovered they had both read and about which they had strong and partially incompatible opinions, which provided the material for 3 separate conversations spread across 3 separate evenings. In February, a letter came from Marshal Cole in Topeka. The case against Edgar Crane had reached the point where arrests were imminent. He was asking for Winifred to come back to Topeka within 2 weeks to give her formal court testimony. He anticipated a trial date within the following month. She sat with the letter at the table in the newspaper office and felt the world rearrange itself around her. This was what she had been waiting for. This was the thing that made the running stop, that made the hiding stop, that made the looking over her shoulder stop. She had known this letter was coming. She had been living toward it for months, and yet the arrival of it was something she had not entirely prepared herself for emotionally. The end of the threat. The end of the thing that had been the organizing principle of her life for over 2 years. The end of the particular terror that had become so familiar it was almost like a way of being. She brought the letter to Gideon. He read it twice and then looked up at her with an expression of careful restraint, the expression of a man who had something significant to say and was taking his time about how to say it. "Go to Topeka," he said. "Do what Cole needs you to do, and when you come back," he stopped. "When I come back," she said. He set the letter on his desk. He looked at her with his characteristic directness. "I'd like to ask you to marry me," he said, "when you come back. I want to do it properly, ask you when this is done, when it's behind you, when you've had time to think with a clear head. So I'm not asking tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're just telling me," she said. "I'm telling you," he confirmed. She pressed her lips together against the smile that was going to escape regardless. "All right," she said. "I'll think with a clear head when I get back." She went to Topeka in the 2nd week of February, and she took the stand in the federal courthouse on a cold, clear Thursday afternoon, and she told the truth. She told it completely, from the night in the alley in Abilene to the present, in the calm, organized, thorough way that she did all things. And she watched Edgar Crane sitting at the defendant's table across the courtroom, and she did not look away from him once, because she had done enough looking away, and she was not prepared to do any more of it. Crane looked older than she remembered. He looked like a man who had known for some time that this moment was coming, and had spent the interval becoming smaller in himself. His lawyer was excellent. She had been prepared for that, and the cross-examination was aggressive and pointed and designed to destabilize, and she sat through it with the stillness she had practiced for 2 years in rooms considerably more dangerous than a federal courtroom, and she answered every question with the same undramatic, systematic honesty. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Edgar Crane was found guilty of fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and the murder of Daniel Joseph Sullivan of Abilene, Kansas, on the 21st of February, 1883. She sat in the courtroom afterward when everyone else had filed out. She sat there alone in the long afternoon light coming through the high windows, and she cried, not devastatingly, not with the kind of grief that undoes you, but with the particular quality of grief that is also release, the letting go of something held so tightly for so long that releasing it is both relief and bereavement. She cried for Daniel, which she had not really done. She cried for the 2 years which she had not had the luxury of grieving while they were happening. She cried for the 14 towns and the false names and the not sleeping and the terror that had been her constant companion. Then she stopped crying. She dried her face. She stood up. She went back to the hotel. She packed her trunk, and she caught the morning stage back to Caldwell. Gideon was standing in the street when the stage pulled in. He did not look like a man who had happened to be in the street. He looked like a man who had been watching for a stage. She got down from the step before the coachman had quite finished handing her luggage, and she walked the 20 feet of mud and cold air between the stage and where he was standing, and she said, "It's over." He nodded. "I came back," she said. "I see that," he said. "You said you had something to ask me," she said. He stood very still for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a plain gold band, not elaborate, simple in the way of all his choices, and she understood immediately that he had had it for some time, had been carrying it against the day, which meant he had been more certain of this than he had let on in the careful, measured way he had of not overwhelming people with the force of his convictions. "Winifred Sullivan," he said, "would you marry me?" "Yes," she said. She had not, she realized, needed the clear head he'd recommended, because she had had the clear head since November. She had had it standing on his porch in the cold sunshine of that first Sunday. "Yes, I absolutely will." He put the ring on her hand. She looked at it on her finger, this plain gold thing, and then she looked up at him and he kissed her in the middle of Main Street in Caldwell, Kansas, in full view of anyone who happened to be looking, which was entirely unlike him, and she responded to it with a complete abandon that was increasingly like her. And Mrs. Aldrich, who was coming out of the general store across the street, observed the whole thing and was understood to have said to the proprietor's wife, "Well, it's about time." They married in April. The Reverend James Caldwell, no relation to the town's naming, performed the service at the Methodist Church on the 14th, which was a Sunday with the most extraordinary weather, the kind of warm, clear spring day that the Kansas plains occasionally produce as if in apology for January. Mrs. Aldrich was there. Josiah Fenn was there, looking both pleased and slightly confused, as was his habitual expression. Deputy Hatch was there in his second-best clothes. Half of Caldwell was there, because half of Caldwell had been watching this particular development with the attentive interest of people who had very few theatrical entertainments available. Winifred wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding month, cream-colored muslin with small pearl buttons, the best dress she had made since leaving St. Joseph, and she felt, wearing it, that she was putting something back on that she had set down years ago. Not naivety, she was not recovering that, nor did she wish to, but the capacity for ceremony, the willingness to show up to a moment and be fully, unreservedly present in it. She had written to an aunt in Missouri who was the last Sullivan she knew of, and the aunt had written back with something that Winifred had needed without knowing she'd needed it, a photograph of Daniel. Young, standing very straight, with the Sullivan red hair and the laugh in his face, even in the stiffness of a posed photograph. She had it framed, and it sat on the shelf with Gideon's books, which was the right place for it. She walked up the aisle of the Methodist Church in Caldwell on Gideon Ralston's side, and she said the words with her whole heart, and he said them with the quiet, absolute quality he brought to everything that mattered, and the Reverend pronounced them married, and she was 25 years old and standing in the middle of a life that was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely, expansively, sustainably hers. The house at the edge of town became their house. She brought her books and they doubled the collection, which required the addition of a second shelf. She reorganized the kitchen to her satisfaction over the first month, a project that Gideon regarded with the equanimity of a man who had no strong feelings about kitchen organization, and was therefore wise enough to simply agree that her methods were superior. She kept working for Josiah Fenn, and she took on 2 additional accounting clients in town, the farrier and the woman who ran the millinery shop, and she had a small regular income that was hers, which she had decided was important to her and had said so. And Gideon had said that seemed entirely reasonable, which was one of the things she loved most about him. They had their arguments, as she had predicted. They were good arguments, not the kind that damage, but the kind that clarify. He was better at returning to equilibrium faster than she was. She was better at identifying precisely what the argument was actually about. This division of labor served them well. She wrote to Marshall Cole that summer to inquire about the status of the other men Crane had employed. The question of remaining threats needed to be answered completely before she could rest in that direction. Cole's response was thorough. With Crane convicted and sentenced to federal prison, the network had dissolved. The 3 men on payroll had scattered. 2 had been located and were in custody on related charges. The third had left the territory entirely. The threat, Cole wrote, was resolved to the fullest extent the law could manage. She stood at the kitchen table and read this letter twice and then set it down and went out to the porch and stood in the afternoon sunshine with her hand on the railing, the same railing she had touched that first Sunday, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. It was done. All of it done. Gideon came out and stood beside her. Cole's letter, she said. He read it. He handed it back. He stood next to her with his shoulder against hers, which was how they often stood when something important had happened, not dramatically touching, not performing comfort, just present. Present in the most literal and fundamental sense. It's over, she said. It's over, he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the Kansas summer moved around them with its enormous, indifferent beauty, and the horses in the paddock did their contemplative things, and she felt, standing here as she had felt the first time she stood here, safe. Profoundly, entirely, genuinely safe. Not because the world had become soft or because nothing bad could ever happen again. She was 25 years old and had seen enough to know that the world did not offer those guarantees to anyone. But because she was rooted, she was here. She was his and he was hers, and the ground beneath her feet was solid, and that, she had learned, was everything. In the fall of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Gideon on a Thursday evening after supper, sitting at the table with the lamp between them, and his face did something she had never quite seen it do before, something that broke through all his habitual composure like dawn through a long night, a pure, unguarded joy so bright and sudden that she had to blink. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Are you all right? How are you feeling?" "I'm fine. I'm considerably better than fine, actually." She was. She had felt, over the past week of knowing, a kind of radiant astonishment at the particular direction her life had traveled, from a girl in St. Joseph with $14 and a trunk to this table, this lamp, this man's hands around hers, this entirely unexpected and entirely wanted new life coming. She was fine throughout the pregnancy in the way she had always been fine, with determination and minimal complaint, though the final month tested her considerably, and she told Gideon in plain terms on multiple occasions that she was going to be perfectly fine, and he did not need to look at her like that, and he continued looking at her like that with complete equanimity. They had agreed, in their way of agreeing to things, thoroughly discussing it until both were satisfied, that they would be delighted by whatever child arrived, and that if it was a boy his name would be Thomas Daniel, for her father and her brother, and if it was a girl her name would be Clara Mee, for his first wife and Winifred's mother. In the last week of May, 1884, Winifred gave birth to a son. Thomas Daniel Ralston arrived on a Tuesday morning with considerable enthusiasm about his own arrival and almost no patience for the process, which the midwife said was a good sign, and which Winifred, exhausted and entirely herself, said was consistent with the Sullivan family characteristics. Gideon sat on the edge of the bed and held the baby with the particular carefulness of a large, capable man holding something small and astonishing, and Winifred watched his face while he looked at Thomas Daniel and felt something she had no name for except complete. Thomas was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions about his environment, particularly as regarded noise level, feeding schedules, and the position of the sun at various hours of the day. He had Winifred's hair, the dark red Sullivan hair, which appeared to have skipped the red in favor of a deep auburn, and Gideon's eyes, a gray-green that looked, in certain lights, like the Kansas sky in that suspended moment before weather. He was, she thought, perfectly exactly himself from the very beginning, which was all you could ask of anyone. They settled into the rhythm of 3. It was a demanding rhythm, a nursing infant and a sheriff's schedule and accounting clients and a household and a small farm at the edge of town. But it was a full one. in the way she had dreamed full might mean when she was making herself small in rented rooms in Caldwell and Tiverton and all the towns before. It was full in every direction. It had texture and weight, and it was real. Thomas learned to walk in the spring of 1885, launching himself across the kitchen floor in the uncertain way of a new walker, enormously pleased with himself for approximately 4 steps before sitting down hard and looking up at them with an expression of total philosophical acceptance. He was a sunny-natured child, curious about everything, with a particular attachment to the horses in the paddock. He would stand at the paddock fence and address them in the solemn, conversational tone that he used for all important relations, and the horses would regard him in their mild and judicious way. In 1886, Deputy Hatch left Caldwell to take a sheriff's position in a town further west, which was entirely the right progression for him, and which Gideon had encouraged and recommended him for. And the town hired a new deputy, a capable young man named Frank Lester who had grown up in Kansas and knew the territory. Winifred organized the handover of the department's administrative records, because she had discovered that the sheriff's office bookkeeping was in a condition that she described to Gideon as creative, and he described as, "I know, I've been meaning to address it," and she addressed it. Josiah Fenn retired and sold the newspaper to a young couple from Wichita, and Winifred found that her accounting client list had grown sufficiently that she no longer needed a primary employer. She was running her own modest bookkeeping practice out of the house, which she had set up in the second room with a desk and files and a view of the paddock, which she considered a significant improvement over the newspaper office's view of the alley. In the autumn of 1886, she discovered she was pregnant again. She told Gideon in the same place she had told him the first time, the kitchen table, lamp between them, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that sudden, absolute dawn of unguarded happiness, and she loved him for it exactly as much as she had loved him for it the first time. This pregnancy was somewhat harder. She was 29 now and had more to do than she had in 1883, and the autumn was punishing in the way of certain Kansas autumns, and she was tireder in the particular deep way of a woman who is pregnant with a second child while mothering a 2-year-old. Gideon took on more of the household tasks without being asked and without commentary, simply because he could see what was needed and did it, which was characteristic of him, and which she appreciated with an intensity she expressed mostly by looking at him, sometimes with an expression that she hoped adequately communicated the full weight of her feelings. In the spring of 1887, Clara Mee Ralston was born on a morning in April with considerably less urgency than Thomas had managed, arriving at her own pace and looking around at the world with the calm, evaluative expression of someone who had decided to be thorough from the outset. She had Gideon's dark hair and Winifred's shape of face, and Thomas, who was nearly 3, approached her initial presence in his home with the uncertain diplomacy of a person who has been told about a significant development and is still forming opinions about it. He formed his opinions within a week. He became Clara's most committed advocate and protector, informing the household of any developments in her status. She was awake. She was not awake. She had made a particular sound with the seriousness of a correspondent reporting from a significant location. Winifred watched this with a warmth in her chest that was very like laughing and very like crying at the same time, and she looked at Clara in her arms and thought, "This is what I came west for. Not this specifically, I came west for Daniel, but this is what the West gave me that I could not have imagined from St. Joseph." The years moved. They were good years. There were hard things, there are always hard things in a life, and the hard things were not nothing. The winter of 1888 was devastating, and they lost 2 horses and half of a season's grazing income, and had 3 months of genuine financial strain that required careful management of a kind Winifred was, at least, well equipped to provide. Gideon dealt with the violence that the West continued to generate with the same measured, non-spectacular competence he brought to everything, and occasionally it was frightening. There was one incident in 1889 involving a man with a rifle who had grievances about a land dispute, and who discharged the rifle in a way that sent Winifred's heart into a state that she did not fully recover from for several days, though Gideon emerged unharmed, and she had the old fear for a while after. The one that said nothing good persists, that the people you love are taken. She talked to Gideon about this. She had gotten better over the years at talking to him about the fears rather than managing them alone. This was one of the things that had required active unlearning of 2 years of alone survival habits. He listened in his way. He said, "I know, I'm careful," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He said it with the same flat, standing quality he had always brought to things he meant absolutely, and she believed him, and the fear did not go away entirely, but it settled back to a manageable size. Marshall Cole wrote to them occasionally. He had moved up within the federal system by 1889, was managing a district office in Topeka with several deputies under him. Edgar Crane was in federal prison and would remain there for at least another 15 years. Cole's letters had a quality of friendship to them. He had never become a friend exactly, but he had become something in the family of known and trusted people, and she kept his letters in a wooden box with Daniel's photograph and the paperwork from the trial and a few other things she was keeping. Thomas started school in 1889. He went with the enthusiastic expectation of a child who had been read to since before he could understand reading, who had grown up in a house with books on every shelf, and who had inherited from both his parents a particular orientation toward ideas as things worth pursuing. His teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Perkins, sent home a note in October to say that Thomas had informed the class in some detail about the difference between a fiscal year and a calendar year, and that while this was impressive, it had not been precisely part of the lesson plan. Winifred kept this note in the wooden box too. In 1891, Gideon was offered the position of county sheriff, a larger jurisdiction, more resources, more responsibility, a different order of work. He discussed it with Winifred over several evenings with the thoroughness they brought to major decisions, and she could see that he wanted it and was also holding it loosely, waiting for her assessment. She told him he should take it. He told her what the increase in demands on his time would look like. She told him she had managed considerably more complicated situations than a county sheriff's schedule, and that he should take it. He took it. The work was more demanding, and she felt the shape of his absence in the evenings when he was late. But the house was full. Thomas and Clara were 9 and 4 in 1893, and Thomas had developed strong opinions about astronomy that required regular outdoor sessions with a small telescope Gideon had ordered from a catalog. And Clara had developed a talent for drawing that resulted in the sustained population of every wall surface in the house with carefully observed portraits of horses, dogs, the family, and on one occasion the mayor of Caldwell, who was rendered with an entirely involuntary and highly accurate lack of flattery. On a September evening in 1893, Winifred stood on the porch of the house, their house, the house she had walked to in cold November sunshine over 10 years ago, and she watched Thomas and Gideon in the paddock, the boy explaining something to his father with the gestures of someone who has a large idea to fit into small words, and Gideon listening with his complete, undramatic, genuine attention. Clara was inside drawing something at the kitchen table, and the lamp was on, and the door was open behind Winifred, and the September evening air was doing something perfect with the light golden and clean, the way September did it, as though the year was getting one good moment right before it turned toward winter. She thought about the woman she had been in the boarding house in Caldwell in September of 1882, packing her trunk, looking at the door, deciding not to leave. She thought about that woman with a tenderness that was very different from pity. It was more like admiration, or recognition, or the specific love you feel for your own past self when you can finally see it clearly enough to understand what it carried. That woman had been trying so hard. She had been so tired and so afraid and so determinedly not showing it, and she had walked into a sheriff's office and told the truth, which had been a braver thing than it looked from the outside. And the man behind the desk had listened, and had helped, and had been, against all her prior experience of how things went, trustworthy in the most fundamental and sustaining sense of the word. She had felt safe on this porch for the first time in years. She felt it now, 10 years later, deeper and quieter and more settled. Not the startled relief of that first feeling, but the accumulated, proven safety of a life that had been built honestly and held carefully. Gideon looked up from where he stood in the paddock and caught her eye. The evening light was on his face, and he was 53 years old, and there was gray at his temples, and she loved him with the particular, rich, specific love that only exists on the far side of years together. He raised a hand. She raised hers. Thomas said something, and Gideon looked back at him, and she heard Thomas's voice carry across the yard in the September air, explaining his astronomy with the particular voice of a child who has been taught, by two parents who took his ideas seriously, that ideas are worth explaining carefully. She went back inside to where Clara was drawing. She looked over her daughter's shoulder at the drawing. It was the house, she realized, their house, rendered with the careful fidelity of an 8-year-old who was better at observation than most adults. The porch was there, and the paddock fence, and two stick figures in the yard that were clearly meant to be Thomas and Gideon. "That's very good," Winifred said. Clara considered the drawing with the calm, critical eye of a working artist. "The fence isn't right," she said. "I need to fix the fence." Winifred smiled. She sat down at the table. "I can see the fence needs work," she said. "Fix it." Clara fixed it, tongue between her teeth, with the absolute focus of someone doing something that matters to them, and Winifred watched and thought, "This is enough. This is, in fact, precisely enough. This is the whole thing." The door opened and Gideon came in, Thomas behind him still talking about constellations, and the kitchen was full of voices and lamplight and the smell of the supper that had been on the stove. And Winifred looked at this room and these people, and she felt the thing she had been feeling since before she could name it. The thing she had first felt standing in cold sunshine on a wooden porch at the edge of the Kansas plains. Safe. Home. Her own. She had not felt safe anywhere in years until she had felt it standing on his porch. And she had been feeling it, in growing and uninterrupted and sustaining measure, ever since. They were at the kitchen table, all four of them, which happened less often now that Thomas was 9 and considered himself a man of affairs. And Gideon served the supper, and Thomas told them about Orion, and Clara showed her father the drawing, and he looked at it with the same focused attention he gave everything worth attention. And Winifred sat at the table she had sat at for 10 years and held this moment, held it with both hands, held it the way you hold things you know are precious. Not with fearful tightness, but with the open, secure grip of someone who has learned, finally and completely, that some things stay. Edgar Crane was in prison and would be for years. Daniel's name had been spoken in a federal courthouse and heard. The false names and the rented rooms in the cold alleys were 10 years behind her. She was Winifred Sullivan Ralston, county sheriff's wife, mother, bookkeeper, reader, arguer of points that did not require arguing, resident of Caldwell, Kansas, occupant of a house she had helped to build in the sense that mattered, built not with her hands, but with her steady, determined, entirely deliberate daily choice of it. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. It was what she had said the very first night from across the room in the boarding house, and she had said it many times since in many ways and for many reasons, but tonight she said it the way she had been meaning it the longest, the deepest, the most, for the porch and the fire and the hand in the dark and the ring set on the table against the day she came home, for the completely specific miracle of him. He said, "Always." Thomas said, "Are you two going to be embarrassing again?" Clara said, "I need more pencil." And the lamplight held them all, and outside the Kansas night was doing its enormous and indifferent and perfectly beautiful thing, and Winifred Sullivan was home,